All right, welcome back. So this week we continue our discussion of transferring property interests, which we started last week. We talked about gifts, right? That was the main thing we talked about. We said there's special requirements for gifts because, in fact, gifts are themselves a derogation to the usual contract law rules, which are useful to effect the transfer of property, which would require consideration. Then we talked a lot about real estate, right? We talked about deeds. We said you have to have a piece of writing to evidence a transfer of real property. And that's a formal requirement, right? And we said that that's not the nature of the right being transferred. It's simply evidence of the right being transferred. And that's important, right? So license, for example, we said is a contractual right. It's not a property right. So it's a right that is between two people who sign the contract, right? And one person says, I'll allow you to do this, namely show up somewhere sometime. And the other person says, okay, then I'll give you money, right? And that's a right of a contractual nature. One of the consequences of that is that usually, if it is not performed, right, what you can do is sue for damages. You don't have a right with respect to, say, the property, right? The stadium where you had a right to show up to at a specific time. So a license is a contractual right, not a property right. In contrast, right, a transfer of real property, for example. So you transfer fee simple. You transfer your right to own your house to someone else. Now, that right is now no longer between you and the house, right? It's now between that someone else in the house. That someone else in the house means it's a property interest. It's a right that is between you and the thing, not between you and the other person. Right? The relationship between you and the other person is that, right? You are the former owner, they're the new owner. In both cases, the right is between you or them and the thing itself. So, a deed is a piece of writing evidencing what I just said. For example, evidencing the transfer of a fee simple. And that, in fact, is a legal requirement. There's a law somewhere that says, right, Statute of Fraud, that says you have to have a piece of writing to evidence a transfer of an interest in real property. So when you transfer fee simple, as in my example, right, you have to have that done in writing. It's the law. If you don't, it's invalid. The writing, the contract, the deed, does not change the nature of the right. You're still transferring a property interest. A contract only affects that transfer. It's not the source or the nature of the right. It's simply evidence of the transfer of the right, in contrast to my earlier example of a license. So it is an evidentiary requirement, and otherwise you wouldn't need that to transfer property interest, right? It's simply because there's a law somewhere that says that. Then we said there's some exceptions having to do with trusts where, although you do not meet all of the formal requirements for a transfer to be effected, the courts will sometimes save you with two kinds of trust, right? A constructive trust or a resulting trust. In one instance, the court just makes it up, right, to remedy an existing injustice under equity. And in the other instance, right, the court saves the transfer or a juridical act, to be, it's more accurate to be broader, that otherwise would be invalid because of a formality, by creating a trust. It makes up a structure, right, that essentially affects the thing you were trying to do that you could not do and did not do, although you thought you did, because of a formality. Because there's a 1, 2, 3, and 5 in the statute, you didn't meet the 5, and everyone acts as though it was fine. That's what we kind of alluded to with a trust. In fact, as we'll see, the more specific way in which this actually happens for real property, mainly, also personal property, but real property, is with the rules that we will see now, which are the doctrine of part performance. And that is where the court will step in and do what we saw last week, where the court will step in and save a transfer that's otherwise invalid because of performance. So it is a more specific context than what we saw last week. The trusts were, right, a general mechanism that could save anything. It didn't have to be a transfer of property. It didn't even have to be a transfer. It could be anything, any juridical act that you were trying to perform that you did not adequately perform. That was saved by a trust. Oftentimes, that would not apply to the statute of frauds because it's a specific requirement that's added kind of thing, as I described earlier, right? It's specifically added where it otherwise wouldn't exist. So the court would be kind of hard-pressed there to say, well, it's not really necessary for it to be in writing now, right? Because it's an additional requirement. It's a single evidentiary requirement out of one, right? 1 out of 1. And the court would step in and basically nullify the statute of frauds, right? By finding a trust. And that is clearly not the intent of the legislature, right? Because the people in Ontario haven't yet woken up and decided that they wanted to get rid of that law, which they could, right? Even if the statute of frauds was received, right, imported from England through reception, you can still abrogate it, right? You can still get rid of it. So, what the court will do, though, is in a much more specific situation and in a much more specific way, it will enforce a transfer that does not meet the requirements of the statute of frauds. It's not in writing. Where? First, there is part performance, hence why it's called the doctrine of part performance, of course, right? There is performance, and there is performance generally of both parties, right? So there is a transfer, it's not valid because you don't meet the statute of frauds requirements, but then everyone acts as though it happened. Everyone acts as though someone bought the house. Performance. And the statute of frauds would be used to defeat that. And as we'll see, in a kind of strategical way. So someone comes in, could be a third party, could be one of the two people, and then they try to abuse the statute of frauds, right? Although everyone acted as though everything was fine, as though the transfer did happen, someone shows up and says, well, it's not in writing, so the whole thing's going to be canceled. And usually they do that for strategical reasons in a way that's not consistent with the underlying issue of the statute of frauds. And you'll see it's mentioned specifically in the cases, right? It's essentially would be a fraud upon the intention of the parties to do it that way, in that case. And that is not the intent of the statute of frauds, right? The intent of the statute of frauds, as the F indicates, is to prevent fraud, right? It's so that you don't have one person saying this person bought my house for 300 grand, the other person saying it's not true, and then you have a battle of the witnesses in court, and the court has to decide on a very big thing, right? The transfer of a 300 grand asset based upon testimonial evidence, based upon he said, that we don't want, right? Because that leads to fraud, to people saying that in court, and the court having to adjudicate upon that, and often with major consequences because usually, right, real property is expensive. So that's the purpose of the statute of frauds. Of course, if you have someone who strategically comes in and tries to say, this transfer was not effected properly, I want it canceled, when everyone's been acting as though it happened, right? So everyone agrees. It's not that he said, it's the exact opposite. Everyone agrees. Now someone tries to do the opposite, right? To invalidate that strategically, then the court will step in with that doctrine because it would be, in fact, the opposite of the intent, underlying intent of the statute of fraud. And that is really the only, to overstate it, but only slightly, situation where the court will save such a transfer for real property. Okay, and this is related to something we call unjust enrichment, which is another doctrine that you have under the law, right, contract and tort law. Essentially, right, if there is no often contractual relationship and then someone does something to their detriment, then they can claim under unjust enrichment. So they pay something for someone, everyone assumes that they'll get paid back, but they don't sign a piece of paper that says that, and the person doesn't want to pay them back, right? You have unjust enrichment. You don't have to worry about that, but you can see how it's related, right? How it's related because performance means reliance. Reliance upon a promise, right? In that case, it's oral. It's invalid, therefore, because it's oral, not in writing, not compliant with the Statute of Frauds, right? However, it's relied upon. And therefore, right, similar to unjust enrichment, which also requires reliance. So, for example, under contract law, right, to be more specific, right, there's a promise, doesn't constitute a complete contract, then the counterparty, because they've been told that you do something, they assumed it was right, and then they went out and bought something. It is unjust enrichment, right? You have unduly relied upon the promise, you have impoverished yourself to the benefit of the counterparty. Okay, then you have an example of that in the Starlight case, which is somewhat recent, as you'll see, right? These issues are somewhat recent, 1979. Here. 1979, right? So the willingness of courts to do something which is ostensibly the opposite of the wording of the Statute of Fraud, of course not its intent, as we said, but the opposite of the wording is somewhat recent, because of course, as we said, right, it's there for a reason. If the legislators didn't like it, they would have gotten rid of it. They didn't, right? So it's there. Court has to apply the law, has to respect the law, right? So courts have only recently been willing to go essentially against the wording of the Statute of Frauds and say it doesn't apply because of equity. So what do you have there, right? Complicated thing. Someone wants to start a franchise. They want to lease out essentially some real property to do that. Then, right, they hire some guy to negotiate on their behalf. Then they get to an agreement. Then they sign the piece of paper. Then they send the piece of paper to the owner or whoever, whatever permutation of the owner it is, and then that person does not sign it. I think it's the CEO, right? The president. The president, right, Mr. Kenneth, does not sign it. But he keeps that to himself, right? Doesn't tell anyone in the company, right? I didn't sign the piece of paper. We're going to make a lot of money with that, right? He doesn't tell anyone, and then everyone acts as though it was signed, right? They just assume when it goes to Kenneth's desk, right? Kenneth takes care of it. He signs a piece of paper, as he should, because we just agreed on a contract. We put the terms in writing. We sent it for signature. We assumed it will be signed. So you have part performance, right? So you have detrimental reliance. Someone invests into the thing as though the contract existed. That's the part performance. And as I said earlier, you have that of both parties. In that case, both parties. So, right, the company on one side, the company on the other side, except for Kenneth, right? But other emissaries of him, right, act as though the promise, right, the contract were valid, even though it was never signed. That is, right, of both parties, it's a violation of the Statute of Frauds. More specifically, right, and this is actually good to know, but it says it has to be in writing, and it says it has to be signed. So this is not all that relevant. I assumed it so far, right? Of course, if we say the transfer has to be in writing, the assumption is that, right, the writing is valid because both parties signed it, right? Otherwise, it's not a deed. Nonetheless, specifically, that's what the Statute of Fraud says. So has to be in writing, has to be signed by the party to be charged. Essentially means both parties for our purposes, right? Then you get into all sorts of colorful stuff as to, you know, whether computers exist or not. and whether that's a signature, the answer is yes, so you don't have to worry about that. But the writing means it has to be signed for our purposes. So Kenneth did not sign, right? Kenneth was the person who was supposed to sign, therefore the piece of writing does not meet the statute of frauds. So the court finds, right, the things that you have to find. Finds reliance, performance, right? Therefore, it can be enforced. So you have, right, acceptance by conduct. That's how the court puts it at 520. And I am trying to find you the reference for something else I wanted to mention. So I can't find the page reference, you will, but it's with a view of the transfer. So essentially the part performance has to be geared towards, right, acting as though the transfer happens, which means it's, right, the action that counts as the part performance has to be related to the assumption that there was a deed. So there was a transfer of property, essentially, which almost never will pose a problem. Nonetheless, it's a requirement. So, page 520, you have there mention that, you have the test mentioned, 520, 521, right? Oh, there it is. That's what I was looking for. So, 1, must be such that not only be referable to a contract such that alleged, but be referable to no other title. So, the action is consistent with the transfer that you assume to have happened. That's what the words mean there. 2, right, such as to render it a fraud in the defendant to take advantage of the contract. So they try to abuse the statute of frauds by invoking the formality when they have been acting in compliance with it. 3, the contract is otherwise enforceable. So it's actually important, right? You also have to have, and this is somewhat intuitive, still a requirement, right? You have to have a contract that's otherwise enforceable, which essentially means generally that it has to be specific enough. So if you are trying to enforce something that doesn't have all the key terms, it's not a contract, won't be enforceable. That's essentially what it says. So you have to have all the key terms, because otherwise it's not enforceable as a contract, right? So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to enforce a deed, right, that is not a deed because it hasn't been signed, so not compliant with the statute of frauds. So the deed, the transfer of property, did not happen because you violated the statute of frauds, right? So what you're trying to do, you're trying to enforce it, although you don't meet the statute of frauds. Well, it's one thing, right? But once you do that, of course, there has to be still a contract to be enforced. You have to meet the contract law requirements, right? So you can get exempted from the evidentiary statute of frauds requirement there, right? But that won't be much use if the contract, the underlying contract, is otherwise unenforceable for some other reason, namely that it's not a proper contract, doesn't contain all the key terms. 4, there must be parole evidence of the contract. Essentially, right, someone has to testify that there's been adequate part performance. Okay, slight discussion, page 522, not all that important for our purposes, of acts of preparation. So that's where you get into trouble with what I just mentioned, right? The action has to be, let's say, geared toward the nature of the transfer that you think has been effected. So acts of preparation, that is when you do something that is not necessarily only consistent with a transfer of property having happened. For example, right? You get really excited about signing a contract, therefore you go buy something. And it's something that you would have bought in being excited about signing a contract, which is not the same thing as something you would have bought because you signed the contract, right? Which is completely different, right? It might be that when you sign the contract, or you mistakenly think you signed the contract, you go out and hire a contractor to do the kitchen. That you would not have done on a house if you didn't think that you had signed the contract. In contrast, right, getting excited and going to buy something because you're excited that you're going to sign a contract, that is an act of preparation. There's lots of better examples than that, but you see essentially it's an act that you would have done not because you thought you signed the contract and pursuant to the requirement, an act that is not solely consistent with an assumption that you did sign the contract and therefore does not meet the requirement of part performance because it's consistent with an intention other than having signed the contract. Okay, then you have another case, Erie Sand, 2009, which discusses essentially a right of first refusal. So, what happens there? You have a number of parties, actually. Someone makes an offer on the land. So they want to buy a piece of land, right? There is a right of first refusal of, say, the neighbor, right? The neighbor has the ability to say, no, if you get an offer on that, contractually I have a right to say, no, I will offer as much money, and then you'll have to sell to me. That's what a right of first refusal is. It's a contractual right to get a look at the offer being made upon the land and to beat it, depending on how it's phrased, right? Either beat it or make an equivalent offer, and then it has to be sold to you. It's the first refusal. You refuse that it be sold to someone else. So, what happens there? Someone makes an offer, then adequately and contractually, right? They go to the counterparty, right? They go to the neighbor and they say, here's the offer we got. You have an opportunity to make an equivalent offer. Then they make an offer, right, that turns out not to be equivalent. Nonetheless, it is accepted. So the offer is slightly different. You have the detail at page 527, and it's accepted even though it is not similar enough. It's not the same or better. Therefore, it did not meet the contractual requirement for the right of first refusal, and therefore, right, the other party was not contractually prohibited and in fact should have had their offer accepted. And then the issue is whether, right, that can be saved by the doctrine of part performance. So you have the offer being made, then they accept the other offer, which is inferior, right? So of course, the first offer would not, the first offer hasn't been accepted, and in fact, there's a later second offer which has been accepted legally in writing, right, pursuant to the requirements of the Statute of Fraud. Page 528, you have what I mentioned earlier, that the purpose around paragraph 49 of the case, you have what I mentioned earlier. The purpose of the Statute of Frauds is to reduce fraud, right, by forcing there to be writing so that people don't fight over testimonial evidence as to who owns an asset. And that is not, right, consistent with allowing a party to defeat that strategically for the reasons which we mentioned and won't repeat again. You have the task, page 530, which I mentioned. You have to have part performance, right, being that of the party who had, I'm at the very top, 58, had, to the knowledge of the other party, so it has to be mutual, as I mentioned, acted to his detriment, it's the unjust enrichment thing, right, in carrying on irremediably his own obligation, performed upon the contract, and as we said, it has to be an intention that's consistent only with, right, the juridical act that you thought was being performed. Paragraph 90 is where you have, right, the thing about the conduct which I just mentioned. The conduct must also, in and of itself, indicate that there has been some dealing with the land. So not just any conduct, right, a conduct that's geared toward the illegal operation that you thought was being performed, namely in that case, a transfer in land. The standard is a reasonable person, paragraph 94, right, pretty intuitive, not all that important. And then you have a discussion of, right, the party that could not get the property, they did rely upon because essentially the court finds, and this is a bit muddy, but the court finds that that it's irreplaceable, right? So there's a prejudice there. They could not find a similar property, and quite importantly, that's where the court draws a distinction, probably for the underlying reason I just mentioned, right? That's speculative, but 97, because you have a full deposit, right? It's not the same as a deposit, right? It's essentially part performance because their deposit is the entirety of the purchase price, and I'll write it down here, paragraph 97, is the entirety of the purchase price, therefore it's essentially performance, right? They did their part. The bargain was, right, I give you land, you give me money, right? The party had performed the entirety of their obligation. They paid the money, the entirety of the money, just a bit, not just a bit of it, which was the entirety of their obligation under the contract. So, court finds that that's detrimental reliance, and also finds that essentially the third party would have come in and defeated that intention by using the statute of frauds specifically. Okay, page 535, you have a short note there as to the fact that it doesn't have to be necessarily the act of one of the parties for it to count under the doctrine of part performance. Nonetheless, the important thing is that it has to be essentially everyone agreeing. So it has to be the act of one party, but to the knowledge of the other party. Then there's a very long discussion from page 536 of the applicable test, which gets complicated, right? And the courts aren't given clear on that. Initially, the test was under the Dunman case that it had to be unequivocally referable, right? Which is the nature of the intention there. So unequivocal intention that only matched, that's what unequivocal means, right? Only matched the nature of the property transfer that you thought was being effected. Then there's a discussion as to whether or not that was relaxed in subsequent cases. The answer is it's not clear, right? It might have been somewhat relaxed, but generally remains pretty stringent. And so, right, it has to be clear in the way that I described earlier. It has to be clear that your action matches what you assume to have happened. It has to be clear that, right, your action is not equivocal, right? Doesn't mean it has to be 100% sure, essentially, because it was relaxed, right? But it has to be pretty clear that your action matches mainly or only the nature of the act that you thought was being performed when that action is relied upon to enforce, again, a promise that otherwise would be unenforceable because of the statute of frauds. And of course you have, right, the other requirements that you see quite a bit, right, which help clarify that intent, right? So when the other party knows, it helps clarify that intent. and when you have, right, an otherwise enforceable contract, also helps with that. Last thing that's mentioned is an agreement to agree, right, which is a best efforts clause, essentially, which is related to what I mentioned earlier. So you'll recall I mentioned earlier that you had to have a contract that was enforceable, which means you had to have all the terms. Sometimes it's not clear, right? Especially when you have an agreement to agree, which we saw last week, right? We said you agree to sign a deed, and the court counts that as essentially the deed, right? In that, it creates an obligation. There's exceptions there, right? For example, your home inspection is an exception. You're getting your mortgage is an exception. So there are exceptions, but, right, you have an agreement to agree, and the court finds that it's essentially like the deed in that it forces you to sign the deed in that agreement. So if you don't respect it, the other party doesn't just sue you and get money, right? They actually get to force you to sign the deed under specific performance because, right, that's what you agreed to. That's what the court found last week. So that's where it gets equivocal sometimes because, of course, why in the world would people agree to agree, right? Usually, if you're going to sign a contract that says we'll sign a contract later, right, except in that very specific context, you would have signed the actual contract, right? There's no reason for you to sign a contract that says you'll sign a contract. You'd have signed the latter contract then. So sometimes, right, it will be interpreted as an agreement to negotiate. So you have an agreement to try to come to an agreement, which will be more equivocal, won't have the entirety of the terms. We'll just say you have to try to agree. And in that case, right, that's not an enforceable contract. So you don't have all the required terms. And the court interprets that as a best efforts clause. So you can't refuse to negotiate. If you agree to negotiate, you can't negotiate in bad faith. You have to make a good faith effort to negotiate and come to an agreement. That's how the court interprets that. Essentially, best efforts means, right, you make your best effort to try to come to an agreement. But the court can't force you to agree because you agreed to negotiate, right? And if it forced you to agree, that would have been the agreement which you did not yet sign. And we will pause there and get back later with mortgages under law and equity, which is separate from what we just said, right? Different kind of property interest that's held by a third party in real property.